Visit Elmhurst.org to explore the new City of Elmhurst website. Find out the latest Elmhurst news, pay utility bills and parking tickets, report concerns, and much more. Elmhurst.org is an ideal way to discover what Elmhurst offers your business, your family, your life.
Good evening and welcome to the Rudolph G. Shadi Lecture Series. My name is Joel Herder, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this lecture this evening. But before we get into it, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Shadi and how this series came about. Almost from the day of his arrival in 1946, Dr. Shadi came to love Elmhurst College and became an enduring part of it. He was an important presence and a beloved friend in the Elmhurst College community, and his passing on November 29th of the year 2000 was felt very personally by many. Dr. Shadi immigrated to the U.S. from Germany in 1928. He came to Elmhurst College 18 years later at the urging of his professor, who we all know and recognize, Reinhold Niebuhr. And Dr. Shadi was chairman of the Department of History and the Division of Social Sciences for many years, where he taught Greek and philosophy. He retired from the classroom in 1978 and later was named Emeritus Professor of History and Curator of the College Archives. Dr. Shadi was also honored in 1995 with an Elmhurst College Founders Medal, the highest award that the college offers. In grateful appreciation of his years of service and his status as a role model and his excellence as a teacher, Elmhurst alumni gathered together and determined that Dr. Shadi and his legacy would never be forgotten. The Dr. Rudolph G. Shadi Endowed Lecture Fund was created during the homecoming of 1984, an event dedicated to Dr. Shadi. And then 3 of his former students established a lasting tribute by soliciting gifts to fund the lectureship, and income from this fund is used to sponsor an annual campus lecture, usually pertaining to history or ethics. Charter subscribers included alumni, friends, colleagues, and churches, and of course additional gifts have been and will continue to be gratefully received through the Office of our Development here at the college. And we have with us this evening Rudy Shadi, Dr. Shadi's son. Rudy is a trustee at the college, and I'd like Rudy to stand and be recognized. And now let me introduce Jennifer Boyle, the chair of the Department of Political Science, who will introduce our speaker. Have a good evening.
Good evening and welcome. It is my privilege to introduce to you Mr. Lou Cannon. Mr. Cannon is a distinguished journalist and author who has been described as Ronald Reagan's foremost biographer. Mr. Cannon has written 5 books about Reagan, including the best-selling and most thorough President Reagan, The Role of a Lifetime. A Book of the Month Club main selection when first published in 1991, the book was updated in 2000 and will be reissued in 2011, the centennial of Reagan's birth. The late John Chancellor of NBC called the book indispensable, saying that it presented the real Reagan without the makeup or the handlers, seen through the eyes of the keenest Reagan watcher of them all. George F. Will praised Mr. Cannon as Reagan's best biographer. Mr. Cannon attended the University of Nevada, and San Francisco State College and served in the United States Army. He worked for various California newspapers before joining the staff of the Washington Post, for which he worked 26 years and covered the Reagan presidency. Mr. Cannon won numerous awards and prizes, including in 1984 the coveted Aldo Beckman Award, named after a correspondent for the Chicago Tribune for overall excellence in presidential coverage. Mr. Cannon has written 9 books, including Official Negligence, an acclaimed social history of the Rodney King case and the 1992 Los Angeles riots. For the past decade, Mr. Cannon has been a freelance writer for such publications as the National Review, the New York Times, and the Los Angeles Times. He is editorial advisor and columnist for the online StateNet Capital Journal. The father of 4 and he lives in Summerlin, California, near Santa Barbara, with his wife and researcher, Mary. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Lou Cannon.
Thanks, Jenny, for that nice introduction. It was pretty much the way I wrote it. I like the way she says thorough. That's the best way to describe a book that's long. Anyway, it's really a pleasure to be with you here tonight, and I want to thank the trustees and Rudy Shadi, who I had the pleasure of meeting at dinner, and Joel Harder. But it's just great to be here at a lecture that's named in honor of a distinguished professor of history. I didn't have the privilege of knowing Dr. Shadi, but he had the reputation of inspiring others, and I've been fortunate to have teachers and mentors who inspired me. The accomplishments of teachers live on in the work of their students, and for tonight's speech on Ronald Reagan, I've taken as my text the wise words of another person I never met, the British historian C.V. Wedgwood. "History is written backward, but lived forward," she wrote. "Those who know the end of the story can never know what it was like at the time." I first knew Ronald Reagan as a fading actor who lacked a day of experience in public office, but had the seemingly ridiculous notion of governing the most populous state in the nation. Certainly none of us knew the end of the Reagan story at that time, but Governor Reagan became, and I covered him as a reporter for a California newspaper. Later, as White House correspondent for the Washington Post, I covered his 8 years as president. I wrote books about him in an effort to better understand him. Tonight, I'm going to offer my personal reflections on Reagan and his legacy, and I urge all of you to put aside your settled views of Reagan, whatever they may be, and see him anew. Reagan was not your everyday politician. Often it was said of him, "What you see is what you get." But with Reagan, one didn't see everything, and he can't be explained in any simple or ideological terms. Next year, we'll be observing the centennial of Reagan's birth. He was born in Tampico, 115 miles west of here, in February 1911, 3 years after Dr. Shadi was born. His mother, Nell, was a member of the Disciples of Christ and an incurable optimist who believed that everything happened according to God's plan. She was a smart dresser with a dramatic flair, too. She immersed her younger son, Ronald, in church theatricals when he was little more than a toddler. His father, Jack, was a shoe salesman. He was a Catholic, a foe of intolerance, and an alcoholic. Ronald Reagan's first autobiography tells a searing story of how he dragged his drunken father, a heavy man, in from the snow when he was a small and slight boy. Jack Reagan was a dreamer who thought that life was always going to be better in the next town. As a result, the Reagans were a nomadic family, and Nancy Reagan, for one, told me that she thinks this had as many consequences for the Reagan children as Jack's alcoholism. Jack Reagan lived in 8 Illinois towns, including Chicago, some of them twice. When Ronald Reagan was between the ages of 6 and 10, he was in a different school every year for 4 years in Galesburg, Monmouth, Tampico, and Dixon. Small wonder that Ronald Reagan had no close friends as a child except for his brother Neil. He wasn't in one place long enough to make enduring friendships, and as an adult, he consequently had few close friends. What he did have, however, was a pleasing personality that made him liked by almost everyone, and he possessed his mother's shining optimism. For Ronald Reagan, the half-full glass was usually overflowing. Ronald Reagan's political career is conventionally dated from October 1964, when he delivered a rousing nationally televised speech on behalf of Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater. It ended 25 years later in 1989 with the completion of Reagan's second term in the White House. But Reagan was a political person all his life. He participated in a student strike as a freshman at Eureka College in Illinois. In Hollywood, he was a major player in the complicated politics of the Screen Actors Guild, which as president he led in a successful strike against the movie producers. National politics intrigued him. Reagan was stirred by Franklin D. Roosevelt and his promise of a New Deal for the American people. The New Deal gave jobs to his father and brother in an agency that provided relief to other jobless persons. Ronald Reagan remained grateful to FDR, even as his politics changed, for the rest of his life. As a college student, Reagan used a broomstick microphone to give a passable imitation of FDR's inaugural address and its famous peroration, "We have nothing to fear except fear itself." Actually, as FDR biographer David Kennedy has observed, America had plenty to fear other than fear itself. The banking system was broken, and 25% of Americans were out of work, while others worked at any job they could find for a few dollars. There were problems abroad, too, not least the rise of Adolf Hitler. But FDR's relentless optimism lifted the nation and struck a chord in Ronald Reagan that would resonate throughout his life. The Republican Party had need of this optimism after the 1964 election. Reagan's nationally televised speech had made him a political star, but it hadn't helped Goldwater, who was buried by President Lyndon Johnson in one of the great landslides of history. Goldwater had led a conservative takeover of the Republican Party, but his critics claimed had destroyed the GOP in the process. Reagan disagreed. At a time in the media that the Republican Party might go the way of the Whigs, Reagan wrote in National Review that the election demonstrated that 26 million were committed to freedom. Nor did Reagan believe that all the 43 million opposed conservative ideas. He thought they'd been misled by a false image of conservatism projected by Goldwater's opponents. Excuse me, I'm going to take the lid off this and have some water. There was a void in Republican leadership after that 1964 election. And a group of Reagan's friends, most of them self-made Southern California businessmen, wanted to fill it with Reagan. They suggested that he run for governor of California in 1966. Reagan was intrigued. The governor of California was Pat Brown. He was a Democrat. He had considerable accomplishments as a governor, and he defeated the Republican powerhouses Bill Nolan and Richard Nixon in the 2 previous elections. Political division within his own party, however, and the inevitable ravages of incumbency had weakened Brown, and he believed that there only was one possible way he could win a 3rd term, and that was if the Republicans were goofy enough to nominate Ronald Reagan. In Brown's eyes, Reagan was a B-movie actor who had been upstaged by a chimpanzee in the movie Bedtime for Bonzo, while he, Brown, was doing great things for California. Brown's strategists oddly believed that Californians would never elect an actor, even though Reagan's friend, the song and dance man, George Murphy, was then a sitting senator from California. Brown also thought that Reagan could be demonized as a right-wing extremist, which he tried to do. Reagan, however, didn't scare people. He said with a smile many of the things that Goldwater had said with a scowl. He also hired a political consulting firm, Spencer Roberts, that had run the California primary campaign not of Goldwater, but of his arch foe, Nelson Rockefeller. That was an early sign that Reagan was a practical man who wanted good people around regardless of ideology. Now, it still didn't seem to most people that Reagan was going to be governor, and when Reagan was asked in '65 how he would do if he was elected governor, Reagan said, "I don't know, I've never played a governor." He was similarly self-deprecating with reporters. During the campaign, a reporter found a studio picture of Reagan with the chimpanzee Bonzo and asked Reagan to autograph it. Reagan did, writing above his signature, "I'm the one with the watch." Reagan won the governorship, defeating Brown by nearly 1 million votes. 4 years later, he was reelected to a second term. The governorship, which I'm not going to go into in any detail here, but it's an important part of the Reagan story. California was on the cutting edge of the counterculture of the 1960s, with the attendant student demonstrations over civil rights and the Vietnam War and free speech and other issues. The Watts riots of 1965 had exposed racial fault lines. Californians were discouraged, and they were traveling, in smog over crowded freeways. And I think for the first time we're beginning to wonder if this was really the good life they'd come to California for. Reagan promised to restore the state's equilibrium, but he stumbled early in his governorship. Some of his appointments were ill-considered, and he bungled in an attempt to change the treatment of the mentally ill, most of whom in California in those days were warehoused in these large, inefficient, and really ghastly state hospitals. The psychotropic drugs that we now take for granted were just coming into use, making it medically possible to treat mentally ill people outside the hospitals. But community treatment centers were lacking. The public employee unions were opposed to change. Reagan emphasized fiscal savings instead of reform, and he had to back away from his proposals. On the other hand, Reagan grasped economic realities with astonishing swiftness for somebody who had never been in office before. The Brown administration had avoided a tax increase with an accounting gimmick, leaving Reagan with 9 months of state revenues to pay a year of state expenses. Reagan was committed to budget cutting, but he realized during his first week in office that taxes would have to be raised. This crucial decision demonstrated Reagan's practicality. He was willing to put aside preconceptions to get things done. He eventually signed into law a $1 billion tax increase that was then the largest tax increase in the history of any state. Now, in today's dollars, that would be a $6.5 billion tax increase. And any current Republican governor, and probably any governor of any party, who proposed such a tax increase would be accused of violating Reaganite principles and face almost certain defeat. The most interesting thing about the tax increase, however, is not its size, but its composition, because it was a very progressive tax increase. It raised taxes on corporation, banks, and insurance companies, which were then a sacred cow in California, and it raised personal income taxes for everybody, but progressively so that the wealthy paid much more. Beyond the tax bill, however, the achievements of Reagan's first term were modest. For much of those 4 years, Reagan was locked in a war of words with Democratic leaders in the legislature and at times with Republican leaders, too. They were a little more polite than the current group of politicians, but they weren't much more productive. But this changed in Reagan's second term, as the governor and the Democratic leader of the Assembly, a fiery man named Bob Moretti, decided that they needed to write a record of accomplishment. Reagan and Moretti rolled up their sleeves and negotiated an important welfare bill that anticipated and compares favorably to the national bill that President Clinton and Newt Gingrich would hammer out 2 decades later. They followed that up by negotiating tax and education bills. And this whole process was a very valuable training for Reagan, who as president would again find it necessary to negotiate with an able legislator, in this case Tip O'Neill, who headed a House with a Democratic majority. Reagan was a first-rate negotiator. He had learned these skills in the Screen Actors Guild, facing movie producers as set in their ways and as myopic as any politician. Many years later, I asked Reagan, we talked about the bargaining in Hollywood, and I asked him what was the most neglected aspect of his political career, and without even thinking about it, he said, my 6 years as president of the Screen Actors Guild. When I followed up by asking what he'd learned negotiating for the Guild, he responded that the purpose of a negotiation is to get an agreement. This conversation took place shortly after President Reagan had returned from Geneva in 1985 following his first summit meeting with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. So let's look more closely at the improbable path that led Reagan to Geneva. The best place to start is in Dixon, Illinois, which Reagan considered his hometown. Reagan was an adventurous, athletic boy, but with eyesight so poor he couldn't see a thrown football, much less a baseball, until it was right upon him. So he became a swimmer and a lifeguard. As a boy, he worked 10 to 12 hours a day for 7 summers on a treacherous section of the Rock River that runs through Dixon. Everyone has heard about the 77 people he saved from drowning. Few remember that he also chipped and brought the blocks of ice for the park concession and cleaned up the stands at the end of the day. He worked his way through Eureka College without financial help from home, and then helped his brother get through college. In a literal sense, he was always his brother's keeper. Ronald Reagan typically made light of this, and he learned to joke about his work habits. It's true no one ever died of hard work, but I figure, why take the chance? He once told a gridiron dinner. In fact, he worked hard whenever he had to work hard. He had a love affair with radio. When he graduated from Eureka, he landed a part-time job with an Iowa station as a sports announcer. He became a full-time announcer, but almost lost the job because he couldn't read a commercial properly. He taught himself. He learned that if he could memorize the first paragraph, that the rest of the commercial would sound natural when he read it. In time, he became smooth and professional, but it was the product of considerable effort. Then he went to Hollywood in 1937, at a time when it was the mass culture capital of the world, and millions of Americans longed to be in the movies. Reagan became a movie actor. He didn't know the first thing about it, where to stand, what to do, how to kiss a girl, but he learned. He always had his lines memorized, and he was so dependable that the directors valued him. This reliability actually kept him too long in the B-film division of Warner's, where, as Reagan put it, they didn't want the films good, they wanted them Thursday. In 1940, however, he broke through the B-film barrier as the doomed Notre Dame football player George Gipp, and he went on to have a successful career, often playing, as Gary Wills put it, the heartwarming role of himself. Reagan's great gift was his voice. His most useful attribute was his self-deprecating humor. He poked fun at his age, his movies, his ideology, his vanities, his memory lapses, and the suspicion that he was unintelligent. When he was president, his amiable press secretary, Marlin Fitzwater, fell asleep on Air Force One. Someone took a picture of the sleeping Fitzwater. It circulated to Reagan, who signed it with the inscription, "Marlin, we're only supposed to do this at cabinet meetings." Reagan never let his ego get in the way of what he was trying to accomplish, and he rarely held grudges. After he was elected, he surprised outsiders by choosing as his White House Chief of Staff James Baker, who had managed the campaign of George H.W. Bush against Reagan, and 4 years earlier ran the delegate operation for President Ford that had staved off the Reagan challenge. How many presidents would pick the closest aide of their opponents as their own Chief of Staff? To answer that question, I think ask that question is to answer it because Reagan was the only one who ever did. It was a smart move. Baker performed brilliantly. Soon after he chose Baker, Reagan, then the president-elect, went to Washington and he met Tip O'Neill. Tip tested him by saying that California was the minor leagues and Washington was the big leagues. Reagan's aides resented this. They thought it was very disrespectful. But Reagan told me that he thought it was advantageous to be underestimated by the Speaker of the House. After all these books and all these years, it remains something of a mystery to me as to why Reagan was so consistently underestimated. Certainly it was understandable that Pat Brown underestimated him because Reagan had no record then as a candidate. But when he acquired a record, it didn't seem to make any difference. Gerald Ford said in his memoirs that he didn't take Reagan seriously when aides told him that Reagan would challenge him in 1976. Subsequently, President Carter underrated Reagan. On the day George H.W. Bush upset Reagan in the Iowa caucuses in 1980, I had dinner in a Des Moines restaurant with a Carter aide who lamented that Bush would be the nominee and that he would be hard to beat. The Carter folks wanted Reagan, and they got their chance. After his defeat in Iowa, Reagan rose to the occasion in New Hampshire in a confrontation with Bush in which Reagan used a paraphrased line from a Spencer Tracy movie. I paid for this microphone, and Reagan won big, and he cruised to the nomination. That fall, in a debate with President Carter, Reagan won the day with another one-liner, "There you go again." But it wasn't just a casual one-liner. That line had been premeditated by Reagan, who had used it in a debate rehearsal. After Reagan became president, he was underestimated by the Democrats, by the Washington and academic establishments, by much of the media, until Gorbachev came along, by the leaders of the Soviet Union. Hal Raines of the New York Times was then a White House correspondent. 2 decades later, he wrote, "My generation of White House correspondents was accused of covering up Ronald Reagan's supposed stupidity and his reliance on fictional facts derived from Errol Flynn movies and the John Birch Society. In 1981, Clark Clifford, the Democratic wise men, entertained Georgetown dinner parties with the killer line that Reagan was an amiable dunce. 20 years later, we know that Clark Clifford was charged in a banking scandal and that the dunce ended the Cold War." Reagan wrote this line in a column. He was discussing presidential intelligence. As readers of President Reagan, The Role of a Lifetime, will know, I deal with this issue in my book, relying heavily on Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. Reagan had a high level of what Gardner called interpersonal intelligence. He wasn't analytical like a lawyer, but he picked up on people. Once, after an Oval Office meeting, Reagan asked what it was that someone in the room had against him. Mike Deaver, a close aide, replied that the person Reagan was asking about hadn't said a word. But Reagan asked Deaver to check it out, and it turned out that the person who hadn't said a word was opposed to Reagan on the issue that had been under discussion, and Reagan had somehow picked it up from the body language of the man. Reagan also had a splendid temperament, a quality that history suggests is more important in the presidency than raw IQ. If we're to rank the presidents of the 20th century on a commonly accepted scale of intelligent quotient, Woodrow Wilson, Herbert Hoover, and Carter would be high on the list. The quality of the Wilson presidency remains a matter of debate, but clearly Hoover and Carter were not, on balance, successful presidents. Many would give a low IQ ranking to Harry Truman and Reagan, who were more successful. But the best example is another president with a happy temperament who was not seen as particularly bright. This is the president of whom a biographer wrote, "He was his own least reliable witness, unable or unwilling to tell the truth about his early years. Few leaders in our history can have labored harder to create a personal past less rooted in reality. There is always both more and less to him than meets the eye." The biographer is Jeffrey Ward, and he's writing about President Franklin Roosevelt in a book that I loved called First Class Temperament, The Emergence of Franklin Roosevelt. The title is taken from a famous judgment passed by Oliver Wendell Holmes, who FDR visited in his Georgetown home on March 8, 1933, which was Holmes' 91st birthday. FDR had just been installed as president. Holmes had retired from the Supreme Court. They chatted. FDR asked about a sword over the mantel. Holmes said his grandfather had used it in the French and Indian War. FDR told him that his grandmother went back to the Revolutionary War. That wasn't true. Both of his grandmothers had been born after the Revolution. After FDR left, the friend who had sat through the meeting asked Holmes his opinion of the new president. "A second-rate intellect," Holmes said, "but a first-class temperament." It wasn't meant as a compliment. In addition to his temperament and a remarkable persistence, Reagan came to the White House with a unique background. It wasn't just the acting. In the 1950s, when his film career was fading, Reagan had made a successful transition to television as host of General Electric Theater, which led the Sunday night ratings for many years. He also toured the country for GE in what turned out to be a very valuable political apprenticeship. He was an average speaker at the beginning of this apprenticeship and a good one when it ended. Reagan made his own connection with America on these GE trips. He was afraid to fly at the time, and his contract called for him to travel everywhere by train. Typically, he traveled alone, reading the local papers and making notes on papers that were transferred to the cards from which he spoke. He'd grown up a Democrat, voting for Harry Truman in 1948. But in 1952, along with millions of other Democrats, he voted for Dwight Eisenhower. By 1960, he was a Democrat for Nixon. He changed his registration to Republican when Nixon ran for governor in 1962. Why did he change? There are a number of reasons, but economics played a big part in his change of views. After World War II, Reagan was making money for the first time in his life when marginal tax rates were at an all-time high, and individuals, unlike corporations, couldn't average their income. This was very hard on celebrities and people in the movie business who might earn a lot of money in one year and very little the next. Reagan even talked to friends about a human depreciation allowance, like the oil depreciation allowance. It wasn't an idea that caught on. But Reagan steadily became more critical of tax burdens and government regulations, about which he later heard a lot from middle-level managers on his GE tours. Still, Reagan did not change all of his political opinions. He was a consistent free trader who realized that the protectionist high tariffs under Herbert Hoover had helped bring on the Great Depression. By the time Reagan became president, it was the Democrats who were protectionist. Reagan remained a free trader. He ran for president 3 times before he made it, abortively in 1968, and then again in 76 against Ford. By the time he won in 1980, he was a really tested candidate, and he believed he had a connection with the American people, with ordinary Americans. I've described Reagan as a mirror who reflected our own values back to us. But here's what Reagan had to say on the eve of his election as president when a radio reporter asked him what it was that Americans saw in him. Reagan hesitated, and then he said, "Would you laugh if I told you that I think maybe they see themselves and that I'm one of them? I've never been able to detach myself or think that I somehow am apart from them." Political scientist Hugh Heclo, sort of picking up on this theme and deepening it, held that Reagan held a sacramental vision of America. It is expressed in this commencement address that Reagan gave to William Woods College in Fulton, Missouri in June 1952. Reagan called the speech, "America the Beautiful." "I, in my own mind," Reagan said, "have thought of America as a place in the divine scheme of things that was set aside as a promised land. It was set here, and the price of admission, the means of selection, was very simple as to how this land should be populated. And any place in the world, and any person with these places, any person with the courage, with the desire to tear up their roots, to strive for freedom, to attempt and dare to live in a strange and foreign place, to travel half across the world was welcome here. And they have brought with them to the bloodstream that has become America that precious courage, the courage that they and they alone had in the first place, to this land, the unknown, to strive for something better for themselves and for their children and their children's children. I believe that God, in shedding His grace on this country, has always, in this divine scheme of things, kept an eye on our land and guided it as a promised land for these people." Now, Reagan was a Democrat when he gave this speech, which was shortly before the Los Angeles County Democratic Central Committee declined to endorse him for an open congressional seat on the grounds that he was too liberal. So much for the acumen of the local Democrats, one is tempted to say. But Reagan's vision of America as a free society that drew its strength from the courage and bloodstock of its immigrants was then considered a liberal view. Liberals in those days celebrated the American melting pot rather than the diversity of the human ingredients. The genius of America was not that it perpetuated differences, but that it obliterated them and created a new being, an American. As FDR said in a campaign speech, all of our people all over the country, except the pure-blooded Indians, are immigrants or descendants of immigrants, including even those who came over on the Mayflower. Reagan's sacramental view of America made him an internationalist almost by definition. And that was true when he was a Democrat, and after he became a Republican. He had no use for what he described as isolationist views. When he ran for president in 1980, he proposed the North American Accord, which was his visionary, if unrefined, idea of a common market embracing Canada and Mexico. Reagan was an apostle of what became the North American Free Trade Agreement. In his foreign policy outlook, Reagan combined views that to some Cold Warriors seemed incompatible. He was an ardent anti-communist, some of this the legacy of his struggle with left-wingers in Hollywood, but he was also haunted by the notion that the United States and the Soviet Union could blunder into war if the policies of mutual assured destruction continued, and each side had thousands of nuclear-tipped missiles pointed at each other and really on hair trigger, so they could be launched at a moment's notice. At the Washington Post, when he was running for president, Reagan acknowledged that the military buildup that he advocated could lead to an intensified arms race. But Reagan saw this as desirable because he believed the Soviets could not compete economically and would come to the bargaining table. To Reagan, unlike some of his cheerleaders, the arms race was always a means toward an end. Before considering the results of Reagan's approach to the Soviet Union and his meetings with Gorbachev, I'd like to examine his economic record as president. It's conflicted, to be sure, but as George Bernard Shaw wrote of Wagner's music, it's better than it sounds. Reagan promised during his 1980 campaign that he would reduce income taxes, increase military spending, and balance the budget. It's tempting to say, and I've said it, that he accomplished the first two promises at the expense of the third. But this is too facile a summary. Reagan inherited a dismal economic situation in which inflation was near an all-time high and public confidence was very low. He hoped that the supply-side tax cuts he promised and pushed through Congress would produce a robust recovery, and he made premature forecast of success. Sound familiar? Instead, the nation plunged into recession. During the late months of 1982 and the early ones of 83, unemployment reached even higher levels than it is now. It was 10.8% at one point, and Reagan's approval rating was lower than President Obama's is now. It fell below 40%. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker broke the back of that recession in the old-fashioned way with high interest rates. And here is where Reagan showed his mettle. For he backed Volcker at a time when leading Republicans were joining Democrats in calling for Volcker's scalp. Reagan campaigned across the country, repeatedly asking Americans to stay the course. Volcker, a Democrat and a Carter appointee, said he received more backing from Reagan than from the president who had appointed him. The recession gave way to 6 years of unprecedented economic growth. And under Reagan, the marginal tax rate declined from 70 to 28%. In Reagan's early months in office, there was overblown rhetoric, much of it from the White House budget director David Stockman, about cutting the budget. But if you had gone to Mars during the Reagan years and returned to examine the budget, you wouldn't have necessarily known that we'd had a Republican president. Americans are conservative, said the columnist George F. Will. What they want to conserve is the New Deal. Will estimates that the middle six budgets of the Reagan years produced deficits of $1.1 trillion, and that Reagan was responsible for all but about 7% of this, with Congress adding the rest. All told, the deficits of the Reagan years were $1.5 trillion. But there's another side of the story. Budgets that Clinton and Gingrich were able to achieve in the mid-1990s were possible in large part because of a reduction of $800 billion in defense spending that occurred after the Cold War ended and the Soviets called it quits. So how did this come about? Reagan's first presidential term did not seem promising for U.S.-Soviet relations. The Soviets had a series of geriatric leaders whom Reagan reached out to without success. Reagan's rhetoric scared the Soviets. So did the Strategic Defense Initiative, Reagan's fantastic plan for a missile defense that the Soviets thought was a cover for a U.S. attack from space. There was a war scare on September 1st, 1983, when the Soviets shot down a Korean passenger jet that had strayed into Soviet airspace, killing 269 persons, including 61 Americans. There was another war scare the following year when the Soviets misinterpreted a routine Western military exercise as a preparation for attack. On January 1, 1984, Time magazine chose Reagan and Soviet leader Yuri Andropov as Men of the Year and featured them on a cover standing grimly back to back. Reagan had been willing to meet with the Soviet leaders from the outset, but as he put it in an odd but accurate locution, they kept dying on me. Leonid Brezhnev was succeeded by Andropov, who was succeeded by Konstantin Chernenko. After Chernenko died, Gorbachev became the Soviet leader. Reagan's staunchest ally, Margaret Thatcher, immediately sensed a difference. So did Reagan at Geneva, the first of the series of summits he held with Gorbachev in Reykjavik, Washington, and Moscow. Reagan's goals in dealing with the Soviets have been variously defined. Condoleezza Rice said to me in 1999 that the Cold War was frozen in time when Reagan became president and called the Soviet Union an evil empire. It was like there was this crazy aunt in the basement that no one wanted to talk about, and then once you said she was there, everyone said they knew it all along, Rice said. Rice knew the Soviet Union had to be talked about and talked to as well. Before he became president, he told Richard Allen, who became his first national security advisor, "My idea of American policy toward the Soviet Union is simple. Some would say simplistic. It is this: we win and they lose. What do you think of that?" It wasn't, of course, that simple, as Reagan himself would acknowledge in his memoirs. Negotiations with Gorbachev were long and difficult. Gorbachev was trying to reform a system that defied reform. He was also a moral man whose grandparents on both sides had suffered at the hands of Stalin and who did not believe that communism should be maintained by means of force. Once again, Reagan's negotiating background helped. Jack Matlock, an important advisor to Reagan on Soviet matters and later the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, has written persuasively in his book, Reagan and Gorbachev, which I highly recommend that book, that Reagan realized it was necessary to persuade Gorbachev that the cutbacks in nuclear arsenals and other forces proposed by the United States were in the Soviet interest. This was true. No one knew better than Gorbachev that military spending was consuming far too much of the Soviet budget. Recent scholarship suggests that Gorbachev might have moved even more quickly than he did, except for the oppositions of the Soviet military bureaucracy. But move he did. The highlight of the Gorbachev negotiations was the signing of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty at the Washington Summit in 1987. It presaged other far-reaching treaties on strategic nuclear weapons, including the one that is pending in the United States Senate today. But in revisiting the Reagan-Gorbachev breakthrough, let us remember that many of the conservatives who today celebrate Reagan at the time opposed the INF Treaty. George Will called Reagan's dealings with Gorbachev moral disarmament. The great William F. Buckley, the intellectual mentor of the conservative movement, came to the White House to urge Reagan not to sign the very treaty he had negotiated. Conservatives waged a national campaign against Senate ratification. It failed dismally because you simply weren't going to be able to convince the American people that Ronald Reagan was soft on communism. In February 1993, the Princeton Conference on the end of the Cold War brought together leading former U.S. and Soviet diplomats, including former U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz and Alexander Besmertnik, who had been the deputy foreign minister in the crucial last years of the Reagan administration. All agreed that the Cold War had not ended automatically. The participants gave credit to Reagan and Gorbachev, none more eloquently than Besmertnik, who said of them, "As for the common things, I would say that these two men," meaning Reagan and Gorbachev, "were very idealistic. They each had their own ideals, which they tried to follow all through their lives. Their ideals were not similar, but the dedication to those ideals was similar. They both believed in something. They were not just men who would trim their sails and go any way the wind blows. This is what they immediately sensed in each other and why they made good partners." Besmertnik was very scornful of opinions in what he called the American press after Reykjavik that Reagan had fallen short as a negotiator. It wasn't true at all, he said. Reagan handled negotiations very well. He might not have known all the details. He used little cards when he would come to details. He didn't like the formal part of negotiation. He would try to rush through this formal part, and then he would throw away the cards and start talking his direct way. I was across the table at all the summits, followed the president for all those years, and I personally admired the man very much. He was a good politician. He was a good diplomat. He was very dedicated. And if it were not for Reagan, I don't think we would have been able to reach the agreements on arms control that we reached later because of his idealism, because he thought we really should do away with nuclear weapons. Gorbachev believed in that. Reagan believed in that. The experts didn't believe, but the leaders did. These leaders came to have this deep symbiotic relationship, and it helped that I think that Gorbachev, unlike any of his Soviet predecessors, realized the power of a democracy, of a system that freely elects its leaders. According to a Soviet participant, Gorbachev was at Geneva. They were meeting before they met with Reagan at the summit discussing strategy, and one of the Soviets began to berate Reagan, and showing irritation, Gorbachev interrupted and said of Reagan, this is the President of the United States elected by the American people. Retrospective books by Matlock, Don Oberdorfer, and my former White House colleague David Hoffman show that Reagan and Gorbachev missed some opportunities, but they got it right in the end. They did so because they both knew that winning and losing would have no meaning in a nuclear war. As Reagan said most eloquently before the Japanese Diet, a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. Overall, it's true that Reagan's foreign policies were not an unmitigated success. Iran-Contra was a blemish, but even Reagan's approval of covert aid to the Nicaraguan Contras was undertaken as an alternative to direct U.S. military intervention suggested by Al Haig, his first Secretary of State. The American people were more concerned about the secret sale of arms to Iran than the Contra part, and the American people were right. We know that pressure from the Contras was one of the reasons that the Sandinista government agreed to a vote of the people that they lost. There's no such redemption for the arms sales to Iran. Nonetheless, in my book, I'm more understanding of the arms sales because I realized that Reagan wanted to free the Americans held hostage in Lebanon than of his ill-fated decision to send U.S. troops into Lebanon as part of an international military force after 241 servicemen, mostly Marines, were killed on October 23, 1983 by a suicide bomber who drove a truck into the Beirut headquarters. Reagan soon began the process of withdrawal. That incident had an enormous impact on Reagan. He called the bombing the saddest day of my presidency, perhaps the saddest day of my life. And he didn't ever again want to put American servicemen and women in harm's way. He was fundamentally a man of peace. According to Schultz, Reagan rejected a proposal near the end of his presidency to send in U.S. troops to Panama to topple strongman Manuel Noriega. Reagan said this would cost the lives of U.S. troops and innocent Panamanians, as it subsequently did when the first President Bush carried out the operation. If you read the transcript of this meeting, it's kind of amazing. By this time, Reagan is pretty much a lame duck, and George H.W. Bush, doesn't want to be seen as too pacifistic with this election coming up. But even Reagan's old friends and supporters, Ed Meese is saying, says at one point to Reagan, he says, American law enforcement is counting on you to do this. And Reagan, who could give as good as he got, said, well, I've just lost my respect for law enforcement. He didn't want to invade, and he wouldn't authorize the invasion. Few presidents are men for all seasons. The ones who make a difference come along in times of crisis, and they lead us to a better place. Ronald Reagan did that. He recognized that nuclear war was a clear and present danger, and he and Gorbachev together much reduced the threat of mutual annihilation. For that, he deserves our thanks and praise. Reagan was a transformational president, and working with Gorbachev, he changed the world.
Mr. Cannon, we want to thank you for your very insightful presentation on how Ronald Reagan changed the course of history. On behalf of the entire Elmhurst College community, we would like to present you with this gift to remind you of your time here at Elmhurst College and as a token of our appreciation. I hope you've enjoyed the first of a series of 3 Shadi lectures sponsored in part by Harris. Please pick up our event publication Applause as you exit the chapel for information on other upcoming events, such as our first Niebuhr Forum on Religion and Public Life being held on Friday, October 1st. The college is hosting a panel discussion at 4:00 p.m. on the topic of Persistence of Evil, Reinhold Niebuhr's Message for Today's World. And at 7:00 p.m., Mr. David Brooks will speak on politics and the influence of Reinhold Niebuhr. At this time, Mr. Cannon has graciously agreed to a book signing opportunity. His book, President Reagan, The Role of a Lifetime, is available for purchase in the narthex of the chapel. If you'd like to have the book signed, Mr. Cannon will be available in the front of the chapel, so please form a line down the center aisle. Thank you for being a part of tonight's event. We look forward to seeing you all in the future.
There are several thousand collisions involving trains each year, which result in over 1,000 injuries and several hundred deaths. A majority of these deaths occur when someone is struck by a train while trespassing on railroad property. Remember, railroad property is private property. Trespassing along railroad property is not only against the law, it's very dangerous. Avoid taking shortcuts. The only safe place to cross railroad tracks is at a designated crossing. Don't get caught dead on the tracks. Stay off, stay away, stay alive.
Hi, I'm Elmhurst Police Chief Steve Neubauer. Elmhurst is a great place to live and work. However, we are not crime-free. Many people in our community become victims of crime simply because they did not lock their belongings. I would ask you to do 2 things. First, lock your car, house, and bike. Secondly, call 911 to report suspicious activity to the Elmhurst Police Department. The Elmhurst Police Department reminds you to lock it or lose it.